Welcome. I'm Rabbi Shalom Bachner, the spiritual leader here at Congregation Beth Shalom. We are both so honored to have everyone here and also a bit sad, as Judaism is a celebration of life, and highlighting our long history of persecution is not something we do joyfully. On the other hand, we are committed to tikkun olam, making the world a better place for everyone. And often that starts with education, including on the important topics of the US and the Holocaust, and the many questions these new films have raised. I want to begin by reading a short message of welcome from the city of Modesto. Thank you, members of Congregation Beth Shalom, for being great examples of goodness in our community. Once again, you are leading the way by teaching us how to be better neighbors, friends, and fellow residents. Modesto must be a place where we learn from each other to ensure that all who live here do so in peace and with respect. I send my love, thanks, and appreciation to you for hosting this event. Take care. I wish you well. Sincerely, Sue Zwalin, Mayor of Modesto. Secondly, for many in our community, including myself, this is not just history. These are family stories. My father was born in Berlin. The family fled to Yugoslavia after being warned by a Nazi officer that horrible things were going to happen to the Jews of Germany. From Yugoslavia, they made their way to the United States in 1938 after being sponsored by a relative of a relative. Before boarding the Queen Mary to take them to the United States, they visited the large extended family of Bachners in southern Poland. Almost none of these people survived. In our lobby are the actual passports from Nazi Germany, including their visa stamps, that allowed members of our congregation to enter the United States and survive this genocidal attempt that murdered 2/3 of the Jews of Europe, 1/3 of the Jewish population of the world. I encourage you to look at these artifacts in the display case and understand that for us as Jews, it's not only that we are 0.2% of the world's population, it is the reality that the most culturally and scientifically advanced country of its day, Germany, systematically murdered 6 million innocent Jewish men, women, and children only 80 years ago. Anti-Semitism did not begin 80 years ago, and it certainly did not end with the Holocaust. Understanding this long and complex history of hatred, violence caused by othering, and many religious, political, and social influences is a key to understanding the Jewish story of survival. Finally, please use the index cards to write down your questions, and I will be collecting them and grouping them for our panelists to respond to. Asking questions is an important part of Jewish culture and our faith, and we look forward to hearing what you want to learn about on today's topics. Let me next introduce our panelists. Dr. and Professor Brett Carroll was born in Newark, New Jersey. He received a BA from Emory University in 1983 and a PhD from Cornell University in 1991, both in history. He is a professor of history at California State University, Stanislaus, where he has been a CSUS Outstanding Professor for Research 2011 to 2012, and served as the Speaker of the Faculty in 2014 to 2015. Dr. and Professor Brett Carroll is the author of the Routledge Historical Atlas of Religion in America, published in 2000. We are extremely honored and appreciative to have him back with us to share his historical expertise and perspectives on these new documentaries. Chaim Singer-Franks is a second career rabbi, ordained in 2014 at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies of American Jewish University, where he also received an MA in Jewish Studies. Chaim joined the staff at Kaiser Permanente Panorama City Medical Center as multi-faith chaplain and spiritual care guide in 2019. He completed clinical pastoral education training in residency at UCLA Santa Monica Hospital in 2017. Prior to his current work, Chaim served as both an interim congregational rabbi in St. Paul, Minnesota. Before embarking upon a life in the rabbinate, Chaim enjoyed a 13-year tenure with the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, now USC Shoah Foundation, the Institute for Visual History and Education, an organization founded by Steven Spielberg in the wake of the historical epic Schindler's List. There, Chaim functioned in content as well as supervisory capacities and trained educators across North America and in Israel on the use of visual history material in the classroom. Along with his three siblings, Chaim was raised in Albany, New York, as was I. His mom was raised in Rehovot, Israel. His dad, of blessed memory, survived concentration and labor camps in Poland and Austria during World War II. It's a real honor having Rabbi Chaim back with us to share his professional and family understandings of this topic. Before we begin with some questions, I want to give both of our panelists an opportunity to share some introductory remarks about the film, starting with Professor Carroll.
I'd like to start by thanking Congregation Beth Shalom for sponsoring this event, to Rabbi Bachner for inviting me to participate in it, to Rabbi Singer Franks and President Jun for participating alongside me, and to those in the audience for coming here to discuss this topic. I hope you'll all indulge me in beginning with two childhood memories. The first came to mind because of the fact that this panel is taking place as many celebrate Halloween, and because it happens that I visited the Charles Schulz Museum in Santa Rosa recently. Every year growing up, I watched It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and every year I wondered about Snoopy's extended World War I scene, a very serious and decidedly unfunny scene which, to a boy's mind, seemed out of place. It was only later, as a young adult, that I realized Charles Schulz's point, that because the holiday tends to trivialize horror and even turn it into fun and games, we need powerful and regular reminders that there are real horrors in the world, and that horror is, to say the least, serious stuff. I'll come back around in a few minutes to the problem of trivializing horror. For now, I'll assume you all recognize the relevance of that memory to the reason we're here today. The second memory brings us even closer to today's topic. When I was in the fourth grade, my rabbi, Eli Pilchik, began one of his weekly talks to us by asking us rhetorically what a Jew is, and then answering his own question by saying that a Jew is someone who remembers. Remembers what? I wondered. What followed, his remarks that morning, was a slideshow of the horrors of the Holocaust, the Shoah, some of which I saw again, we all saw, many of us again, at the end of Ken Burns's film. Now, I suppose one might offer other definitions than Rabbi Pilchik's of what it means to be a Jew, but as an adult who has become a historian, what Rabbi Pilchik said that day resonates with me, more than it did then. Indeed, that is my single clearest memory of Rabbi Pilchik. Like Jews, as he defined them, a historian is one who remembers, who indeed is tasked with remembering. And here, historians get help from documentarians, who often reach wider audiences. The reason I share my two memories, then, is that they point directly to why this new documentary by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein is so important and timely. Now, there are, to be sure, many ways in which a U.S. historian might quibble with them, given their specific interpretive positions on some controversial questions about the U.S. response to the Holocaust. I might, for example, say the film lets President Roosevelt off too lightly, makes him look a tad saintlier than he was, though FDR's approach has been sharply criticized by many historians, not least of all David Wyman, author of The Abandonment of the Jews, the gold standard in the scholarship on this subject. I might say the film is too brief and dismissive on the question of whether U.S. and Allied forces could have bombed Birkenau and other death camps, despite the fact that several historians and military experts have since suggested the feasibility of doing just that. And I might say that while it effectively challenges the blame the victim view of the American Jews were too passive and gives Peter Bergson some of the credit he deserves for pressuring the administration to create the War Refugee Board in early 1944, that it also gives Bergson short shrift overall, elides the very real political tensions within the Jewish community about how to change American refugee policy, and slights the very real debates among Jewish historians about Jews and politics in the 1930s and 40s. Like Will Rogers in reverse, I, as an historian, have never met a documentary that I completely liked. We can talk further about matters of narrative and interpretation in our discussion today. But whatever the, in my opinion, interpretive shortcomings of the narrative offered in this film, I also recognize that its most fundamental messages are spot on and, again, timely. The film offers a powerful and necessary reminder. It calls on us to remember. But what does remembering actually entail? This question is at the very heart of the historian's craft. For me, many kinds of answers come to mind, including questions of narrative and interpretation, what we, for whatever reason, choose to tell ourselves about the past, and what we, for whatever reason, do not. But a few stand out for our purposes today. First, remembering means seeing the past on the micro level as well as the macro level, to see the particularities of specific episodes, to see history not simply as past politics, but as the experiences of the real human beings whom political decisions affect. I was gratified to see historian Daniel Green make this point explicitly in the film. It's especially important to remember this, given the tendency some have shown to universalize the episode. To be sure, some universalize it in a well-meaning effort to appeal to non-Jews. Eleanor Roosevelt herself did it in her introduction to the first American edition of Anne Frank's diary, published in 1952, where she said that she, quote, felt how close we all are to Anne's experience, unquote. And yet she never mentioned Jews or even the Shoah itself. Quote unquote, extraordinary conditions is as close as she comes. Trying to arouse sympathy and concern is all to the good, but universalizing horrors like the Shoah is a two-edged sword, because it can also have the effect of trivializing the event and thereby desensitizing us. Witness, for example, those who have recently protested mask mandates by labeling them Nazism or wearing yellow stars, as if their experiences somehow compared with Anne Frank's. We sometimes do this with African-American slavery, too. This is why Burns does the film as he does, interweaving discussions of American xenophobia and refugee policy with the survivors' own stories. By telling these stories, historians and documentarians humanize the past, particularize it, populate it with people and not just politics and policies, draw us in and make us sympathize without universalizing. And this gives whatever lessons history has to teach us more poignancy and thus more power. And this brings us to another aspect of remembering, learning lessons from what has happened, in this case, preventing horrors like the Shoah from happening again. Western linear logic has often tended to produce an idea of history as ongoing progress. And that idea, that faith one might call it, has sometimes generated complacency, a too easy sense that the present and future will necessarily be improvements over the past. Many of us see the Shoah as an episode in the past. But as Rabbi Bachner reminded us today, it's not just history. Really, past, present, and future are not so easily compartmentalized. Leaving aside that the past lives and casts shadows in the present, something that Shoah survivors and their relatives know all too well. It is not at all a given that the future will be an improvement over the present, or that the practices we thought confined to the past won't recur in the present or the future. Having this episode in our past doesn't mean that we've somehow been immunized. It does mean that we have a specific and horrific case study from which to learn. If we examine how and consider why it happened, and this is what historians do, we become that much better equipped to read the signs, that much more knowledgeable about how the levers of power and policy work and what keeps them from working, and therefore that much more empowered. And this way we increase the likelihood, with no guarantees, mind you, as Gunther Stern warned us at the end of the film, that what didn't kill us will in fact make us stronger, make us wiser. Perhaps I don't need to tell you that we need to work to prevent such reoccurrences. Perhaps you're seeing the same troubling signs I am, many of them raised at the close of the film. The Tree of Life shootings, the 4th anniversary of which we recently observed, the chanting at the Charlottesville March a few years ago, the rantings of Ye and Goyim TV, caps and t-shirts reading Camp Auschwitz, xenophobic cries of America First, waving Confederate flags, the events of January 6th, 2021. What's more, this sort of hate is being amplified by a digital culture that spreads misinformation and disinformation. This is why we need Ken Burns' documentary reminder, nearly 80 years after the Shoah, nearly 100 years after the restrictive immigration quotas of the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. Will the message reach all who need to hear it? Will it reach those who need to hear it most? I'll say yes and no. As a Jew, I'm nothing if not realistic. I imagine that ideological anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers will avoid it, perhaps denounce it. As historian Daniel Green asked in the film, how do you reason with people able to believe both that Jews are capitalists and that they are communists? But I also imagine that the film will reach some of the far larger numbers of people who have never learned about this episode, who have effectively forgotten. To conclude these remarks, I just very recently read a Washington Post article on the new visibility and even brazenness of anti-Semitism in today's United States. The reporter interviewed a former president of the Tree of Life Synagogue, Barton Schachter, who said, quote unquote, "What scares me," he said, "is that in time the shooting would become," and I'm quoting again, "just another thing. The memory of these 11 and 6 million, the 11 being the Tree of Life victims, and the 6 million, that's the hard part. It's an ongoing challenge. It's hard, like you said, whether after 80 years or just 4, to do what Rabbi Pilchuk asked all of us to do, and that is to remember."
Here in Modesto. Thank you to Professor Carroll for your insightful and erudite remarks. I should begin with an important note. Among the identities which I bring to this forum, a rabbi, a child of a survivor, and because I speak as a former employee of the USC Shoah Foundation Institute, I should emphasize that the views I express today are not of that organization, but they're mine alone. There is a storied history to depictions of the Shoah, the Holocaust, in cinema, both documentary and drama. In 1956, the French documentary Night and Fog, shot on location in color, depicted the remnants of the Auschwitz and Majdanek death camps. Interspersed with black and white material from the war, it was both controversial and critically acclaimed. Night and Fog was shown on French TV in 1990 to remind the public of the horrors of the war. We needn't fast forward too far in history, arriving in April of 1961, when the trial of Adolf Eichmann, as depicted in the Ken Burns documentary, was held in Israel, was broadcast around the world. In that momentous media event, many things coalesced in Israeli culture. It was argued not just the world in general, but the Israeli public in particular came to terms in a whole new way with the power and reach of its non-pareil intelligence services, with the implications of justice for the crimes committed against the Jewish people, and also with its own population of survivors. At the end, Eichmann was the only person in Israel's history to ever receive the death sentence, a decision endlessly debated among jurists, theologians, historians, and the Israeli public. And to the Israeli, the consummate human product of Zionist triumph over murderous anti-Semitism, the forever young, strapping emblems of Jewish strength, the Israeli, viewing the Eichmann trial, now came to more fully understand and confront survivors, their neighbors, their cousins, aunts and uncles, those damaged souls who shared their sidewalks in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the wretched remnant of Europe, whom by contrast, the sunburnt, burly Israeli represented the defenseless, defeated, weak, ghettoized Jew. An image offset only by Yad Mordechai, Israel's memorial to the heroic uprising of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. As articulated in historian Tom Segev's landmark book, The Seventh Million, The Israelis and the Holocaust, we learned that in the 1950s, Ben Gurion himself had privately expressed contempt for the influx of survivors to the Jewish state, echoing the garbage science of white supremacist eugenics. Alas, Ben Gurion wanted assurance that the state would be built upon the right human material. However, with the Eichmann trial brandished across TV screens, A mere 13 years after the establishment of the Medina in Israel, it was now inescapable. But for the luck of history, or perhaps the foresight of some relative who emigrated to Palestine before things became impossible in Europe, there we were. Survivors pointed an accusing finger at Eichmann, who sat inside a bulletproof box before an audience and a judge and the world. And the survivors on the witness stand, the traumatized mirror opposites of rifle-bearing, independent, self-determined Israelis. In my home in Albany, New York, I recall an LP record of the Eichmann trial that was hoarse and scratchy from the multiple times it was played by my father, a survivor of 6 concentration and labor camps. And for survivors who theretofore in many quarters of the new Jewish state had been mocked and ridiculed for their alleged docile submission to the Nazis. It pains me to recall it, but for the generation of my mom born in 1938 in Rehovot, then Mandate, Palestine, survivors were at times scornfully teased as sabonim, soap. That in reference to the rumors ultimately debunked that the Germans had manufactured soap from the fat of their Jewish victims. Alas, adolescents in every generation and under every circumstance are still adolescents, and everyone has the right and the responsibility to grow up and to learn. The world would continue in fits and starts to confront murderous anti-Semitism and the Shoah via film and television. Now, already 44 years ago, in what became a watershed media event, the miniseries Holocaust was broadcast on NBC. It was that program, dubbed into German, which brought the German public to face their own history in a manner which would reshape their educational system and by extension transform a taboo topic into kitchen table conversation. 6 years later, in 1985, Claude Lanzmann, his 9-hour documentary simply entitled Shoah, broke the rules of Holocaust documentaries in that it depicted nothing through historical footage or recreation of the massacres, but rather left it to survivors and to perpetrators themselves to speak into the camera. Abraham Bamba, a barber in a Jerusalem barbershop, in the casual process of cutting a client's hair, tells of the same tasks he undertook, but as a prisoner in Treblinka. And who would forget the blood-curdling pride expressed by Franz Schuschomel, former guard at the Treblinka death camp, filmed furtively with a secret lens as he boasted of the ditty which prisoners were forced to sing marching to work at the camp. And who also didn't take issue with Lanzmann himself, whom during an interview with a Jewish survivor, the man's voice breaking as he falls deeper into the abyss of memory, states he cannot speak anymore, with Lanzmann quietly reminding him, "You must." And then there is Schindler's List, dramatized history. Spielberg's film noir masterpiece about a Gentile with conscience. Naively, I believed that Schindler's List might be the consummate nail in the coffin for the practice and convention of Holocaust denial. It was also that film which would induce Steven Spielberg to create the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, where I served for 13 years of my life. An organization whose worldwide reach and scope recorded and collected over 52,000 testimonies of survivors and rescuers, including members of the U.S. Armed Forces who liberated concentration and labor camps. In late 2005, the University of Southern California became the custodian of the Shoah Foundation archive and formed an educational institute around it to craft materials for the classroom to be a resource for researchers around the world. The organization has gone on to acquire and digitize USC's 16mm archive of testimonies for the Armenian genocide. It also recorded witnesses to the atrocities in Rwanda and some who survived apartheid in South Africa. In the first 10 years of its existence, I managed a multilingual department of 45 people who cataloged the testimonies minute by minute, a staff who indexed millions of pages of demographic, personal data in order to fashion the backbone of a videographic encyclopedia of the Holocaust. Nothing would be edited. It would be available to anyone willing to watch, warts and all. In the many demonstrations of our technology to visitors, I stated that we were not offering a history textbook, not the view from 10,000 feet in the air, but rather the picture from the ground level. To that, I would quote from Emanuel Ringelblum's volume of collected personal diaries and stories entitled Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto, calling the Shoah Foundation's archive history through the prism of personal experience. And in time, I too experienced the secondary trauma inherent to those studying it, and also a measure of what we termed Holocaust fatigue. Therefore, I came to Ken Burns's documentary with the same question that many other people have. Why yet another Holocaust documentary? And why now? Why shove this down the public's throat once again? Why subject another generation to these facts, to these images, these thrusts of the human being into the farthest reaches of hell? Because in fact, the United States stands at a unique place in history. It's true. We are faced with an unprecedented resurgence of violent anti-Semitism. Holocaust denial, with its absurdist, contradictory invective of this never happened and they should have killed all of you, now enjoys a revived celebration of white supremacy, a grotesque form which claws its ways to the highest reaches of US politics. That's why. Why another examination of the Holocaust? One in which particular focuses on the failings of the US government to act in a broad and meaningful way to save Jews and others from the killing fields of the Reich? Because its resonance should not be only with Jewish people. This is everyone's story. Ken Burns's thesis is one which exhorts the American public to take a serious look at its relationship with immigrants, with its immigrant policies. One would hope that the viewer would walk away from this film with a critical and urgent reevaluation of where this country is headed. That the viewer, in the wake of January 6th, will critically ask this question: who will be calling the shots in this great nation of ours? What kind of historical revisionism might be in store for us? In our self-understanding as a country of immigrants, a country whose character, whose social and political fabric is strengthened and nourished by its immigrants, we look on as certain governors brazenly dump their tempest-tossed on the doorsteps of other states to deal with. That's why Ken Burns made this particular film. Why? Because this is not just about Jews. But I can tell you as a Jew, as one offspring of a survivor, that we never truly departed from the crossroads of history. In blissful cultural somnolence across the last 77 years, we pretend that this could never happen again. Despite Cambodia, despite Bosnia-Herzegovina, despite Rwanda, despite Bucha and Mariupol, we are again looking down the barrel at a perilous moment in history. And so why this film now? Because film is powerful. Because the difficult messages in this film, newly polished historical mirror, need to be placed before the American public. Because as he lays it out, the Reich received its most sinister template based on American traditions. And who will watch it? We may lament that YouTube Shorts and TikTok have inexorably impaired the attention span of the average viewer. But my friends, that is a lament which in this case strains against the truth. Yes, this is also an age of impaired attention spans, but let's keep in mind it's also an age of binge watching. So yes, it's long and difficult, but we're fully up to it. And so on that note, may it be our will to in fact binge watch this film and ensure that each and every American history class pulls its shades for a few precious hours to do the same. Let us be changed, let us learn. Let the material which reinvigorates a most disturbing motif in our national conversation be revealed.
What do you think are some of the most important messages of the film? And how does it relate to the role of xenophobia and immigration issues in our nation's history? Professor Carroll, would you like to begin?
Yeah, I mean, well, beyond what I said in my earlier remarks, xenophobia as the film, and I think this is one of the film's basic messages, I can't remember who in the film said it, but xenophobia is as American as apple pie. It's always been part of our story. Despite the ideals that the country has often preached, despite the words in the Statue of Liberty, American policies, in fact, rarely, if ever, lived up to that. And as Rabbi Chaim rightly points out, even now, this film forces us to rethink our current immigration policy. I might add, by the way, and I think the film points this out, that when the 1924 quotas were removed in 1965 with the Hart-Celler Act, it did leave certain restrictions in place, two of which stand out. One is that it put sharp limits on the number of immigrants coming from the countries to our south. And the other is that it restricts total immigration only 5% to refugees. And I think those are going to be problems down the road, if they're not already.
I think we should also look at the economic conditions that we're facing. While things are in a roller coaster, if you like, it is a long and storied tradition that we point fingers at immigrants who are accused of taking jobs and so forth, and we lose sight of the fact that these are conditions which we share all together communally, and are matters of a situation that we need to bring ourselves out of communally together, and as hokey as that may sound, it is indeed something that we see happening in the course of our history as a nation. It's a love-hate relationship that we have with immigrants. They pick our vegetables, they make our salads, and they're the reason that our salads are so cheap at the same time. And so our relationship to our ideal as a nation of immigrants needs to be re-examined constantly.
To build on that, and thanks for raising that point, I might add, and I think, can't remember where I read this recently, but at the time that the refugees started coming over from Eastern and Central Europe, this would have been 1933, 1934, the government's policy was that these quotas were in place, and what they began doing too is kind of putting new emphasis on this likely to become a public charge element of the law that hadn't really been paid much attention to before, but in the context of the Great Depression started to get a lot more attention. And what it essentially did was to force our consular officials to become diviners. Are these people going to be a public charge or not? As if there's any easy way to tell that. What strikes me is that that actually flew in the face of American experience. That immigrants had done so much to build this country, and now all of a sudden the concern was what? Almost overnight that changed to this idea that they're not builders of the country, they're the ones who are taking it down. And I think that revives from time to time.
The set of developments and trends highlighted in the three parts of the documentary, which do you feel is the most concerning today, and what do you believe would be the most helpful and proactive way of addressing it now?
Addressing it now, that's a million-dollar question, isn't it? I'm not sure entirely what we can do to address this now. I mean, obviously, like I said, what the film shows us is at least a couple of important lessons on what makes the levers of power work, who pulls them, why they pull them, and why they don't at certain times. And I guess you look at someone like Breckinridge Long, the Assistant Secretary of State, and the kind of bitter obstructionist that he was to letting in more refugees. But I think ultimately, and it's easy to blame this State Department official or that War Department official, but ultimately, if we live in a democratic society where the people are sovereign, people can do those sorts of things because we, the people, let them. We sustain them. I think the answer to changing these things, what do we do now? How do we face these things now? Beyond the education campaign, again, I'm not entirely sure, but it takes a nation to change these policies. I'm not sure what to add to that at this point.
How much time do we have? I think the greatest takeaway from the film is, to me, and it wasn't something that I learned specifically from the film, but it was reinforced in the first of the three parts, which was the role which white supremacy and eugenics played in the formation of the Reich's ideology, and how starkly that was portrayed, and how it was carried and reinforced by our champions of industry, by Henry Ford, and how we continue to be perhaps blind to the fact that these perhaps more subtly and in a more sinister fashion remain as an undercurrent within our culture, and it raises its head here and there, and we see it, and we want to pretend that it's not there, and we want to pretend that we're not facing, let's say, excuse the expression, a form of Christo-fascism that may be informing our political environment in a way that is alarming. I think that's one of my main takeaways from the film.
Questions, and I'll continue to sort them and share them with everyone. I think this really gets at the underlying question that a few people have said. The most poignant statement in Schindler's List was, "You can go east, but they don't like you or want you. You can go west, and it is the same. Jews seem to be a hated group amongst many. Why? How can we change it?" I didn't say it was an easy question.
Well, classically, it's because we were accused of deicide. It was a distortion of history. If a proper history of the period exists, speaking of moving from before the Common Era to the Common Era, and that piece of history has carried forth and has determined the fate of the Jewish diaspora ever since. It's also a function of the role which Jews were put into during the Middle Ages in Europe, vis-a-vis money, vis-a-vis wealthy landowners and peasantry, and the middleman role that we're replaced into. It's long and complicated. The lesson that we pick up from the more recent history is that the message to Jews through the course of history was, well, you can either convert or you can leave. And then the message became, just leave. And then the message became, you can't leave. And so it was a progression of things, and we like, again, we enjoy such this is the best diaspora we've ever seen in the United States. It's unprecedented in the freedom that we have, and the influence and the power that we enjoy. And so I come back to probably the most important point that I could possibly make, which is, as a person with a voice and with a recognition of that power, what are we going to use that power for? Is it going to be just to talk about anti-Semitism, or are we going to use it as a voice for all people who stand threatened by white supremacist violence?
And I think the film left it implied more than making it explicit. But I also think it's the reason why Melvin Painter, the prominent African American historian, was in the film, and that is that I think a lot of people see issues like the Holocaust as more an interreligious issue than anything else. But the fact is that anti-Semitism is racism, plain and simple.
On different things you've said, so I'm trying to figure out which to go to next, and I think I'll take this one. You mentioned white supremacy as a threat to Jews. What about the threat from, quote, the left as well? Recent proclamations from the UC Berkeley Law School affinity group is also a threat. The hatred of Jews comes from both the right and the left. Your thoughts?
It's true. And I've been kind of half following that controversy out of Berkeley about not letting speakers in if they promote Zionism. I think was the criterion. This really represents, I think, a problem, most specifically for the Jewish community, but perhaps for others as well. And that is, it can be challenging. And I put myself on the political left, and those who know me know I would put myself there. I often find that it's quite a conundrum for me. I mean, I support the state of Israel. I believe in its right to exist, and at the same time, especially when political parties in power are not the ones that I would vote for, I sometimes wonder about the policies of the country. And the question for me is, how do you oppose a country's policy without opposing the country's right to exist? And I think I think some of these issues actually get mixed up. For example, one person who looked at Berkeley's policy has suggested it's actually anti-Semitic. I need to be convinced of that, to be quite honest with you. I'm not sure whether what they're aiming at is all Jews or just those who they identify as Zionist. There's the question of whether it's possible to be one and not the other. But I'll just confess that I'm still having trouble wrapping my mind around that relationship between the left and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I'll echo that it's a very difficult problem. The anti-Semitism of the left, there is a critical look at what is taking place in Israel socially and politically, which the left engages in, and it's frankly a very important critical view. And if we're committed to democracy, then it's important for us to take a sober look at what the left-wing critique is, not only of the policy toward the Palestinian people, but also of the rise in fascist rhetoric and praxis among certain factions in Israel. I'm not being an apologist for left-wing anti-Semitism, because I also believe that often anti-Zionism is a veil for anti-Semitism. That's not to say that Jewish power in Israel is beyond reproach. And so we have to be very careful about how we come to a critical view of who we are and the things that we do, and how we manage our own power. What's also new in the wake of the Holocaust is the fact that Jewish people can defend themselves now. And so the question of how we defend ourselves and what we do with our power is a critically important question. And I don't want to mince words in that I don't want to support left-wing anti-Semitism because it has something to say, because I think there is most of the time a pretty clear divide between reasonable critiques of Israel and outright anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish rhetoric.
Related comment and then a related question. A local excellent example of rapid xenophobia is the Japanese, who were sent to, quote, internment camps on U.S. soil in the wake of the paranoia following Pearl Harbor. How many people here today are aware that a large number of these families, approximately 40 families, reside in Belico, less than a short distance from Modesto? Belico is a farming village. How many people even know where Belico is? I'm not asking for a show of hands, but it's certainly raising a fascinating connection with the local community. And I think related to that, you both Professor Carroll mentioned the importance of not universalizing this message too much. And the question is, are there problems for the Jewish people in including other people in the struggle, such as Assyrians, American Indians, the Japanese, and others? Either of you have any thoughts on that?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Are there problems for the Jewish people in including other people in this struggle, such as Assyrians, excuse me, American Indians, Japanese, other minorities? And while you're contemplating that, I'm going to ask the third question because I think it's an extension of the same topic. Please comment on Isabel Wilkerson's comments in Cast regarding how the right learned from America's treatment of blacks. So I guess the questions are, to what extent is this a human or minority struggle or something specific to the Jewish community and Jewish history? And related to that, what are your comments on how America's treatment of its African American population was an inspiration for the Holocaust as portrayed in the Ken Burns film?
There's a lot there. I hope I
There
remember.
is.
Let's see, a couple of things. First, a thought I actually had the last round of questions that I'll toss out there before it slips my mind completely, and that is that part of the issue with Israel and the Palestinians, of course, is a security issue. Every country has its security issues. The United States has its security issues. And I think what we need to do is not let that concern with security bring out the worst angels in our nature, which I think it too often does. So there's that. In terms of are there problems for the Jewish people of including other groups in that struggle? I'm not sure the dichotomy it really holds water. I mean, it can be a Jewish struggle and it can be a human struggle at the same time. And certainly, so far as it's a human struggle, we all are part of it. We don't often recognize that, and I think different groups who are fighting the same struggle don't often recognize they're fighting the same struggle. And maybe that's what happens, maybe if you particularize too much. Maybe there's a danger in that direction as well. But I don't think it represents a problem for the Jewish people insofar as we remember that we are engaged in a common human struggle together. In terms of how the right learned from the U.S. treatment of blacks in terms of the internment centers during World War II, I think, first of all, regarding the Japanese American internment centers, and in addition to the fact that so many people live in Boliko, you may or may not know, by the way, that the Stanislaus County Fairgrounds was an assembly center from which people were sent to these internment camps. One of our graduate students at the university actually had a monument put up there. But clearly, I mean, the right did learn from our treatment of blacks and the way we treated them during World War II. I mean, why was there a double V campaign? Why were some people, why were some African Americans not willing to fight in the war at all? And these the internment centers, and what they tell us, if we're looking for the possibility the U.S. really might have done more, that perhaps racism, anti-Semitism was an obstacle here. What better symptom of that than to look at the Western landscape pockmarked with these internment camps? I think that tells us so much about American policy during this period about refugees and race as what we didn't do for the Jews.
I want to also point out that African Americans serving in a still segregated American armed forces were persecuted and at times even shot at by their comrades in arms when they served overseas. The issue with other people, other groups who share the same struggle, I think the answer to that is that building coalitions that between Jews and any group that has suffered under the oppression of tyranny can only benefit us. That we need whatever differences we may have with other groups, which may be important differences, need to be set aside in order for us to find common ground in the sustenance of a vital democracy. Whether, the invocation of Syrians, I'm not sure I entirely understood the part of the question.
Assyrians.
Oh,
Assyrians.
Assyrians.
The Assyrian Christian community, which is a local minority.
Oh, okay. Well, that's not something that I'm fully familiar with. Yeah, okay.
In a moment, first I want to respond to a question that I think was best directed at me. Question is, do the recent events of anti-Semitic symbols and expressions cause negative events or negative reaction in Congregation Beth Shalom? I'm torn about how to answer this, because the quick answer is no. We are here every week doing activities for our members, for guests. We continue to be a proud center of Jewish life with cultural programming and food and all different kinds of events. And we're not going to let what I think is a small fraction of the community deter us from celebrating who we are. And yet, let's look out the window. We have fencing here. We have lights here. We have cameras. We've hired security. That's a reality of being Jewish in the United States and in most of the world in 2022, that there is an underlying reality that even if it's a small percentage that does not want us here, some portion of that small percentage can turn their rhetoric into violence. And we're not going to allow that to stop us, but obviously that's a consideration. I'll also add that in the 9 years of living in Modesto and identifying quite publicly as Jewish in most settings, I've never received anything directed at me personally, any kind of hatred or anti-Semitic statements. Our congregation does receive some small amount of hate mail and hateful phone calls, not on a regular basis, but I can't say it doesn't happen. So a personal question, which I think all three of us might wish to answer, because it's directed to all the panelists. What did your parents teach you about the Holocaust?
Wow. My father died when I was young, so I guess we have to leave him out of the equation. Although, I could go on and on about this. I mean, the marriage between my father and mother. My mother came from her father and mother were Orthodox Jews. My father came from a group of people that are sometimes called self-hating. They were in Manhattan, and my grandfather actually liked to wear green jackets and say he was Irish and things like this. This actually created a lot of some interesting, as far as I can remember from that point. But they didn't talk much about the Holocaust. My mother did not. My grandparents did not, and they were, again, quite observant. I'll add, by the way, and so again, my first exposure to the Holocaust was Rabbi Pilchik. That day when I was 9, and I saw those slides. That was how I got it, and I asked my mom about it, and she, again, I mean, they didn't really seem to want to talk about it. And I suspect, part of the reason may be there's a kind of a rumor mythology, maybe a fact in my family. I have a great uncle who came over here after World War II, and I have an Aunt Rose who lived here, who had never married. She was 40, and she got married at 40 to this guy who'd come over from Poland. He never spoke English. I never had a conversation with him. He died when I was 13, and so for a lot of reasons, I never had a conversation with him. But the story in our family is that he had lost an entire family over there, came here, started over, and he never wanted to be reminded of it and never wanted to talk about it. And I suspect that may explain some of the silence in my family. I wish I could say more than that.
A couple of different anecdotes. One is that my father, of blessed memory, had the radio on 24 hours a day. I mean, quite literally. It was always on, and we understood that to mean that he always had his ear to the ground in case events turned in some way, that we would be ready and informed. And there was a tension constantly in the house about that, and it wasn't just local radio, it was the Voice of Israel that he constantly had blaring in the house. In terms of explicit discussion of the Holocaust, that's it was kind of more subtle. In Hebrew school, at Temple Israel, our rabbi showed us a documentary depicting some of the more gruesome footage that the liberators took, and then that same documentary was shown on television perhaps a week later, and I remember resting on my dad's knee, and we were watching this documentary together in the living room, and then feeling his knee shake, and looking up at him and seeing this man who theretofore had been my father. He was a statue of a man falling apart. And I was about 11 years old, and at that moment I drew the line between these two events. I thought, oh, that's him on TV. This is what they're talking about on television at the moment. And so that was a sort of a new level of realization. And the fact that he was an angry guy too. He was a broken man in a lot of ways. And my mom's excuse was, so the Germans did that to him. You can't blame him, the Germans did it to him. Which I never fully allowed as an excuse.
My answer to this question is I was raised to some extent by four parents that each had a very different view of things. My mother was born during the war here in the United States, was extremely eager to talk about witnessing the rebirth of Israel, and extremely hesitant to talk about the events that happened when she was 3 or 4 years old. My father was born in Berlin, as I mentioned earlier, but when he came to this country around the age of 10, prided himself on learning English without a German accent, that he continued to speak German and Polish and whatever was the language of Yugoslavia? Slavic? Whatever was the language that he grew up there, but he saw himself as an American, and I don't think wanted to give me any kind of negative imagery from his own childhood. My stepmother also was born here and really didn't want to talk about any aspect of Jewish identity. My stepfather, who I met when I was 6, was a survivor, but also the most warmest, gregarious, funniest person that was in my life. And yet, if a documentary or a news thing came on with Hitler on the screen, he would just start screaming and swearing and murdered my family. And then a couple seconds later, just kind of going back to being who he was. I don't remember an age that I didn't know about the Holocaust. I don't remember some moment of someone sitting me down and explaining it to me. I definitely was aware that my stepfather had no relatives, and that made an impact on me. Decide if you feel comfortable asking it or not. Would you share what qualities or situation allowed your father to survive the camps, if you have an insight into that?
I don't have a perfect answer, obviously. As many survivors would say, luck. He was young. He was 20 when Germany invaded Poland. So he was young and strong, and he was useful. There was a disagreement among German authorities. Should we kill them, or should we use them as part to build our war machine? And both sides won. My dad made the uppers to shoes for the Gestapo and the SS when he was in the ghetto, and so he was useful to them. And he was transferred from one labor camp to the other, where he was slave labored, because, like I said, he was young, and I think that's the best answer I can give.
And then a question. Comment is first and foremost my condolences to all Jews and their families for the shameless deaths from the Holocaust. As an African American, what is happening in Hollywood does not reflect all Black people in this country. Kanye is wrong for his outburst. Jewish people all over the world have been and are the balance of the world that we all live in. If you wish to weigh in on that comment, please do. But the next question is, would you call what is happening in Russia a form of white supremacy? in regards to their treatment of Ukraine? How would you understand the Russian and Ukraine conflict within the context of the Holocaust? Or would you?
Well, I think I said at the beginning that there are some questions I'm not going to be able to answer. Let's see. And quite frankly, I mean, I don't know the dynamics of that conflict, which is actually centuries old, enough to answer that. I mean, I will say that clearly Russians have a sense of racial superiority. The rhetoric they use tends to suggest that they see their conflict that way, at least that they're publicly presenting it that way. Beyond that, I'm just not equipped to answer.
Yeah, I'm going to share that, and moving back for a moment of the remarks regarding the Black community and Kanye in particular. The irony of that, I don't think escapes anyone. That a person who's creative and beloved by so many millions of people around the world would feel empowered by the rhetoric of white supremacy and the emblem which Hitler represented. I don't know how to speak to it, except for the fact that it is empowering. It's I could go back to Don Pagis's poem, or his body of work, in which he talks about the ways in which Jews looked up to their oppressors and the shiny boots of the Gestapo and so forth, because it's impossible not to when you are so downtrodden and see people who are so strong and seem to have it all together. And I don't think that allows us to give him a free pass whether or not he's dealing with emotional or psychological issues. I think we're witnessing something extraordinary in that he feels empowered by that imagery and that rhetoric.
I might add, thanks for pointing that out. Making sense of Kanye, or Ye, I guess he calls himself now. There's a kind of a history in the United States of this kind of thing, where groups, presumably experiencing the same struggle, the same kinds of concerns, have trouble forming those coalitions, forming those alliances, building walls. And I think back to example, if you look at the 1850s, when Irish immigrants started coming to the United States in substantial numbers, relations between, in places like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, relations between Irish Catholics and African Americans, each trying to essentially, it's almost like they were in a contest to see who could kind of buddy up to the whites more effectively by belittling the other. I don't know whether it's accurate to see Kanye in that context, but certainly there is that kind of infighting and the use of epithets by groups who ought to know better.
As the former president of the United States, I want to group them. I wish to be respectful and group them thoughtfully. I'm not going to read all 6 of them, but there is a common thread. Please comment on public officials, including a former president, they wrote openly anti-Semitic statements, including threats. Also on the silence of other public officials. Make America great again and America first were not created by Trump. The Nazis used the slogan, make Germany great again. Is the USA's nationalism inherently anti-Semitic? And again, just to give a flavor of some of these different questions, we were a country of law. Please help us understand how have we come to these days.
Again, there's kind of a lot of questions bundled
There's,
into
I
that.
tempted to read all 6 of them verbatim, but I think I've captured the prevailing sentiment of at least the ones in my hand right now.
So, the rhetoric of a not to be named former president, and we've seen a lot of this lately, because of course, especially in light of comments he made, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago about, before it's too late, why don't we appreciate all the things he's done for Israel, and pointing to the evangelicals as if he didn't understand why they support Israel for the reasons they do, which is really not any reason friendliness to us as Jews. Now, Trump will say, of course, I said his name. He will say, of course, that, well, my son-in-law is, and therefore I can't possibly be. It's kind of like my best friend, some of my best friends are, we all know that line. And it could be that, maybe he as an individual really isn't, but, I'm not even sure that's relevant. The relevant question here is, why does he use the rhetoric he uses, and what political benefit does he gain from using it? And I suspect it keeps those loyal to him. And there are others like him, Marjorie Taylor Greene pops to mind, who, again, clearly find political benefit in using the rhetoric. And again, in a democratic society where politicians feel that the rhetoric is going to get them votes, they'll do it. Politics is an amoral realm, whether we like it or not.
I can't really add too much more to that.
What in your minds contributed to Nazi genocide? What are the warning signs of such attempts at ethnic cleansing? If there's a canary in a coal mine type situation, what does one look for?
Well, I look to the acts of governors of certain southern states who have chosen to unload their immigrant problem in a very symbolic fashion, which seemed to echo the move by Germany in 1938 to dump their Jews across the border in Zbunch, Poland, as if to say, these people are not my problem. To me, that's enough of a canary in the coal mine, not to speak of the other things which the professor mentioned, the dog whistling that's taking place, and it's shocking. And I'm not sure exactly how to manage that when it's the actions of a person who's already in power.
I'll add, by the way, speaking of presidents and politicians, in the debate among historians about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his role, I said before that politics is an amoral realm, and it really is. Some of FDR's apologists have actually tried to suggest that it wasn't that he was anti-Semitic. He may have shared the anti-Semitic sentiments of people of his class. I don't doubt that he did. But those inclined to, and there are, including Ken Burns, by the way, those inclined to go easy on FDR will say, well, it wasn't his anti-Semitism; it's that he was Henry Feingold, I think, put it this way. He was a supremely political animal, and that's why he acted or didn't act in the ways that he did and did not.
Theme, as we move towards the conclusion, how can we stop propaganda before it causes damage? What can I do to help, specifically as someone who's not Jewish? UN-affiliated agencies now estimate the growing climate crisis will produce up to 1.2 billion climate refugees. If our present anti-immigrant policies do not vastly change, Earth can run red with blood again. How do we link our struggles to diminish this possibility? So basically the theme that I'm seeing here is what positive actions should we take that you feel the film is encouraging? What do we do with what we've been talking about?
My sense is, and I'm not sure this will be a satisfying or satisfactory answer, but one thing, read the tea leaves. Take those tea leaves seriously. I think part of the problem in 90 years ago is that the dog whistling wasn't taken seriously until it was too late. I might add, regarding stopping propaganda, I mentioned we live in an age of digital disinformation, misinformation. Maybe we can talk to Elon Musk about how to contain all of this.
Having been a student of Dr. Yehuda Bauer, and he should live long, he's 96. Who's the head of the Educational Institute at Beth Shalom. He said that what occurred, or he argues that what occurred in the Shoah was so unprecedented that it was simply impossible to predict what would have occurred. And he said, don't let anyone fool you into thinking that they knew in advance what was going to happen. And historians can disagree over this stuff, and I'm not a historian. And so I'll go back again, deferring to Professor Carroll. Read the tea leaves. And here's another question. Does it need to get as bad as gas chambers and mobile killing units in order for us to do something about it? Why does it have to get that bad? Why do we have to reach that level of depravity in order for us to wake up? Is it not bad enough already? Is it not intolerable enough already that we even have politicians using this rhetoric, using these words in order to characterize Jews and other groups? To me, that's quite enough in order to wake up. And I have no problem being woke. That's perfectly fine.
My sense is, my sense is the Shoah is not unprecedented. That's the problem. I couldn't help thinking, and again, I think of Nella Pinker and some of the things she said in this film. One could look at the history of the United States as one long, slow motion, ongoing genocide. Where, and I think what was said in the film, where, as the Reich expanded into further and further into Eastern Europe, expelling Jews, expelling them became more problematic, and at that point, increasingly the final solution, so-called, became more viable as a policy. Look at what we did. I mean, we expanded westward. We tried to extrude Native Americans or invite them to join with us and become like us. We ended up confining them to reservations. And again, as we expanded into places that they occupied, finding it harder and harder to decide what to do. But again, I think we've had our own. I won't call it the Shoah. That particularizes, but we've had our own Holocaust.
Op-ed piece in the Washington Post the last day or two with a congregational rabbi asking their community, seemingly somewhat impromptu, during high holiday services, how many people have discussed leaving the United States and where else we would go. And according at least to this article in the Washington Post, the majority of the congregation put up their hands. And encourage those that are readers of the Washington Post to read the entire piece, because this was something that seemed unthinkable up until recently. The constant refrain of, well, the United States is different, and we're safer here, and we were the good guys that defeated all this. As I mentioned when we were discussing this, the preparations for this panel, the film pokes a few holes in that concept, that we've always, done the right thing. My answer to the question of what can we do, well, partially what we're doing right now, I think sitting together and listening to each other remains a profound experience, but I'd say do more than this. We have a tremendous access, all of us, to information and history and news at on our back pockets on our phone. And we could use them not only for TikTok and Facebook and whatever else, but learning about each other and making a point to say, well, I don't know about this community or that community, and what would it look like for me to visit them and encourage people to visit us. I want to read the 4 questions I didn't ask, just so they can all be heard. And then I'll ask a wrap-up question. President Trump claims to be one, if not the most, quote, pro-Israel presidents in U.S. history. His daughter and grandkids are Jewish, yet he said that there were good people on both sides during the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. Why do you think he tries to play both sides, and what can non-Jews do to be allies and live up to the concept of never again? Reading the question submitted to me, is Trump becoming the new Hitler? He likes dictators. How do we block anti-Semitic politicians from running in offices, running for office? Never again. Why not make Jerusalem an international city with the government to be determined? So I realize this is kind of just mixture of various ideas, but anything I've just said that sparked any thoughts?
As far as Trump playing both sides, again, politics is an amoral realm. He does what he has to do to get votes. Let's see. I'm already kind of forgetting some of the other things.
There was a lot in there. Jerusalem, blocking anti-Semitic politicians. Those are the main other pieces.
I mean, in a democratic society, there's nothing we can do to stop people from running. That is their right. What we can do is stop people from winning.
Yeah, the only thing I can say is votes, but it's also a crisis of education. We need to talk about these things. We need to lobby school boards in order to make sure that these things are taught in a critical fashion, and keep the conversation open, because it's not a matter of learning it once and closing the book. It's a matter of understanding human nature. I would take issue with Dr. Bauer's assertion regarding the unprecedented nature of the Holocaust as well, in that this is something that human beings do. It's in our nature to oppress, to commit genocide, unfortunately, and I don't want to say that as a scare tactic. I think it's a matter of looking at who we are as a living thing with sober eyes. We have a tendency to do this, and so let's not exclude ourselves or call the other guys monsters and then pat ourselves on the back. We have to be really, really careful about what we do and what we say and what we teach each generation, because the kids are listening.
I'll ask you both a last question before some concluding remarks. And this is a question that I ask at practically every time we do text study. Anytime we look at a Jewish piece of text, I ask, "Ma ze ba lelamdenu?" What does this come to teach us? So I'd like to ask the two of you, what do we learn from this film? And maybe what do we learn from this conversation this afternoon? What should be the takeaways? What do you want to leave us with as what this came to teach us?
Remember,
Learn.
I appreciate the brevity. Before we conclude this afternoon, I want to invite Dr. Ellen Jun, President of California State University, for some closing remarks.
I want to thank Rabbi Shalom Bachner for assembling this very distinguished panel, and Rabbi Kayan Franks. Thank you for really sharing your fascinating background and your professional career and your expertise. Your comments at the beginning were just extremely powerful, very stunning, and your knowledge has really helped advance our understanding of the Holocaust and the state of Jews in America today. And then to Stan State's very own distinguished professor of history, Dr. Brett Carroll, I want to personally thank you because of your extraordinary experience as a historian, as an expert, and your commitment to justice and equity, and again, your historical knowledge and expertise, and your very personal reflections has done a lot, has been invaluable in helping us frame and advance our deeper understanding here today as well. So, and I have to say, the last two comments that you had, remember and learn, are perfect, because I am actually not a historian. I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist, and of course involved in the whole enterprise of university, remembering and learning. So it's a perfect segue. So on behalf of Stan State, I want to say I'm humbled and want to thank you for inviting me here to say a few words and present some closing remarks today. Again, I want to honor Rabbi Bachner for your commitment to organizing and hosting this event here in Congregation Beth Shalom. As you told me, the memories of the Holocaust in terms of your own personal family have been deeply evocative and painful for you. And yet, you had the vision, the courage, and the conviction to host this event, to have this critical, important discussion so that your congregation, the Jewish community, and others in our Central Valley can come together to learn more about America's role in the Holocaust and to discuss and better understand these issues and where to go forward from here. This is all the more important, especially in the face of Holocaust deniers, and because as a community, all of us must work together to proactively never forget and to also help others to never forget the Holocaust in order that we can uphold core principles of humanity, dignity, and acceptance for Jews and indeed for all humans. So in my closing remarks, I want to focus on just 3 additional points. Number 1, I'll explain them briefly and then talk about them a little bit. And first, number 1, as you so appropriately emphasized, Brett, is the importance of keeping memories alive. Remembering, both of you have talked about that repeatedly. So understanding the power of memory, but in this case I'm saying to also personalize and humanize historical facts and truths for others. So that's number 1. Number 2, coming to grips with America's more ignominious, shameful history. That is, we can now recognize through watching this documentary series that there are sobering, recurrent, contradictory themes in our nation's checkered past history. And we must learn how to combat these troubling, recurring themes of racism, white supremacy, genocide, omission, sanitization, and indifference. And number 3, a call to action for all of us to commit to making personal, positive change. And we can do this by avoiding learned helplessness and personally taking action to uphold the core principles of democracy versus authoritarian rule, and by resisting the tendency to vilify or other, doing the othering activities, to instead champion and advocate for supporting universal principles of human dignity and worth. So first, let me take the first point, the importance of keeping memories alive or remembering. By this, I mean we need to understand the power of what we can do as individuals and as collective communities to personalize and humanize actual historical facts and truths. Now, history is often defined as the study of past societal human events. It can also be defined as telling a story that summarizes societal events. And as part of our educational system in the United States, we all are required to take courses in history classes in high school and in college. Now, someone in the audience asked, when did you first hear about the Holocaust from your own family? So actually, that was a question I was going to ask each of you today. Think back for a moment and ask yourself, when did you first hear about or learn about the Holocaust? Was it from your parents or someone in your family? If not, then did you learn it in high school? Or perhaps if not in high school, did you learn about it in college? Or maybe after college? So the reason I ask, why am I asking you this question? Because remember, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I do want to understand how people learn throughout their lifespan. But if we are never to forget the horrors of the Holocaust, as a nation, we must all be first taught about the heinous historical period of time. Furthermore, if parents, we know that parents actually represent the first teachers for their children. So if parents share their own personal histories and stories, both happy memories as well as the deeply challenging memories, then these stories become part of the ethos of the family that often forms the foundation for their children's memories, who then can in turn make these personalized stories jump off the pages of history and come alive, and therefore they can then pass on these powerful connections and memories for many future generations to come. It would be interesting to know the variation of how many of you in the audience had different experiences of how and when you first heard of or formally learned about the Holocaust. This variation should actually not be surprising, since the authors of our history books, when we grew up, were often written during different time periods, and many authors intentionally and selectively omitted or sanitized American history for what they perceived to be the audience, their audience, the young, vulnerable minds of children who should not be traumatized and who they perceived as not being capable of fully understanding the complexities of tragic historical events. So 2 quick personal examples. First, I want to mention that my husband, Dr. Alan Greenberg, who is here, anywhere, just wave your hand. There he is a retired physicist who is also Jewish. He had already watched Ken Burns' documentary even before Rabbi Bachner spoke to me about this event. And we have discussed Ken's documentary numerous times. And he has reflected on his own history of his family. He now realizes that he was born in Long Island during the time when American newspapers were just beginning to report that Hitler had already begun murdering millions of Jews. He also knew that his parents were born and raised in the U.S., having had their Jewish families immigrate to the United States 2 or 3 generations earlier. And as we talked, he tried to recall if his parents ever mentioned the Holocaust directly to him, and he recounted that he could not remember that they ever discussed this with him as a young boy or growing up in high school, though he did remember hearing or meeting some relatives who he had been told had moved to Argentina to escape the Nazis. This too should not be surprising, as Brett and both of you have talked about, well, Brett especially, that most parents do not want to share their most painful experiences and personal histories of tragedies with their young children. Instead, most parents try to shield and protect their children. They work very hard to create better, more normalized lives for their children, and they cope by repressing and not sharing these harsher truths with their children or their families. That is an understandable fact that we find in developmental psychology. Another quick, relevant personal example comes from my own family. My parents were born and raised in South Korea, and they emigrated to the United States in the mid-1950s. Now, although I was born in the U.S. as a child, and my family, both myself and my family, was often misperceived to be Japanese. And I grew up in the Deep South and in the Midwest during the 1960s. So we were often accosted, verbally attacked, and threatened by white Americans with epithets such as dirty Japs, go home, because they remembered the attack on Pearl Harbor. Just as in my husband's family, my parents never discussed these frightening encounters with us as young children, and just as Alan experienced, I never learned it. In fact, I never learned about the enforced internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans as part of the U.S.'s involvement in World War II. I never learned that all people of Japanese descent in California, and Balico included, had been interned until I first came to this great state in 1986. So this point here is that if we want to keep the memories of the Holocaust alive in the minds of Americans and others around the world, and in our own families, we must personalize these memories, talk with and teach our children, and make the truths of this terrible time real. Now, I believe we are firmly indebted to Burns, Novick, and Bonstein for directing and producing this film now, because it helps to educate our newest generation of students, and especially during these troubled times, to help preserve the facts and the truth of the Holocaust. At the same time, I'm here to say to you, I urge each of you not to turn away from the painful memories of the Holocaust, not to suffer from Holocaust fatigue. So what I'd ask you tonight is to think about what you can do to find out more about how you and your family might have been affected by the Holocaust. And then I urge you to keep these stories alive in your families. Please talk to your children, your grandchildren, and to others, so that these personalized stories and truths of the Holocaust will be remembered with searing impact. Together, we must build unassailable, enduring memories of the truth to counter the dangerous rhetoric of the growing number of Holocaust deniers and the perilous impact of social media misinformation. Just witness the potentially deadly assault of Paul Pelosi by the dangerous anti-Semite attacker that was fueled by lies on the social media. The second point, coming to grips with America's more ignominious, shameful history. We must, as a nation, come to terms with a very sobering, newly awakened, critical understanding of the recurrent and contradictory themes in our nation's past checkered history. These are recurring themes of racism, white supremacy, genocide, anti-Semitism, sanitization, and indifference. I agree with Ken Burns, who has said, quote, "I will never work on a more important film in my life. I've worked on many films and I think are important. I'm working on others today, but this one gathers the threads of all of these things that we would rather conveniently sweep under the rug. People say history repeats itself. It doesn't. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. That's closer to the truth, I think. I think racism, anti-Semitism, nativism, anti-immigrant sentiments, they have all been consistent throughout our history. We have a responsibility to tell these stories, the bad that we are discussing here, but also the good. You cannot separate them. Typically, historical accounts of these forms of discrimination and racism focus on analyzing only one movement in history at a time. We generally never see them presented as a totality that spans over 246 years of American history. What makes this theory, I believe, so starkly surprising and compelling is that Burns and his team focus us to see that all historical negative threads have been a part of or stream of American history since our nation's founding. And chillingly, Burns reveals how Hitler studied American history of racist laws, anti-Semitism, anti-immigration from our own history book and used it to build and justify the Nazi strategies and laws against the Jews in the early days of his regime. So these movements were led, as you heard, by some of our most venerable leaders and heroes, not by some other demonic characters abroad. They are us, and these themes are still here with us today. This recognition has to compel us to use a more critical lens to view ourselves, our past, and our future. We like to tout ourselves as an exceptional nation in America, a land of great opportunity, justice, freedom, equality, and that causes us to conveniently forget our unsavory past histories, to minimize, omit, compartmentalize, or sanitize. The conclusion is we need to take off our rose-colored glasses and squarely face our nation's negative, darker themes so that we can stay ever more vigilant to not repeat these past actions. As historian Deborah Lipstadt has said, the great Holocaust scholar, she said, the time to stop a Holocaust is before it starts. We accomplish this by telling the unvarnished truth of our past, and we must never forget. And the final point I wanted to leave you with is a personal call to action for making positive change. This is something that I think each and every one of us can do, that we can personally, individually, and in groups commit to positive and enduring change by doing what? By upholding in the principles, the core principles of democracy versus authoritarian rule, and by resisting vilification or othering to instead champion and advocate for supporting universal principles of human dignity and self-actualization. And this is even more alarming today to see these same negative past tendencies resurfacing in our daily news across the nation and now across the world. Witness our recent American political landscape showing the rise of fascism, unlawful assaults on American democracy, whether it emanated from the Oval Office after the prior presidential election to the January 6th storming of the Capitol. These events possess unnerving parallels to the past. Racism, anti-Semitism, nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and blatantly attacking the fundamental processes needed for a true democracy. We are indeed living in fragile times for our democratic civilization. So what can we do to take steps? What can you do? What can I do? What can we do together? First, as I said, is do not feel powerless. We have research to show that if people succumb to learned helplessness, you will not necessarily take action. So you should know that each person can exercise effective individual and local actions with others. In fact, it's probably best said by Margaret Mead herself, who has said, you all know the quote, never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. So, how do we do this? I have to share another personal story. My father came to this country as a South Korean immigrant to pursue his education in what? He wanted to study political science. Why? Because he believed so fervently in American democracy. He left Korea with the intention of bringing my mother when he finished his first master's degree, and then continued with his doctorate in political science and international affairs. And so he believed, I remember as a young girl, when he would have his very serious moments, he would stop and sit me down in the living room, where the kids never went into the living room. That was for adults only. So he'd sit me down in the living room and he would lecture me, and he would say, the reason I came to America is because of three things. Number one, three important values to him. Number one is to have the choice to have children. Number two, to educate your children to the highest degree possible. And number three, to raise your children in a democracy, which is America. So here is, I'm going to channel my father and my baby sister, who is also a political scientist at USC in American government. How do you make a difference? What did I say again? Stand up to support the core principles of a democracy. Now, yes, politics can be, as you say, amoral. It's the people in the political system who can act amorally. But what I would tell you is that in its instantiation as created by our founders of our Constitution, in some ways, the democracy means that we support core principles of true democracy. There are at least 10. I'll just give you a few. It means that you protect and support, number one, citizen participation. Remember the line in the Constitution, what does it say? We the people produce information to be represented by our legislators, by our elected officials. So citizen participation, become more involved in your responsibility, in your civic responsibility to support the democracy. Also, the democracy is equality for all is a foundational premise. The government must be accountable and transparent and follow the rules of our democratically set up systems, the legislative, executive, judicial, that we have to abide by the rule of law, that there be fair elections and accepting the results of elections, that there be a multi-party system, that we have to control the abuse of power, that we are provided with economic freedom in a democracy, and we must always uphold human rights. So this means, in my third comment, is that wherever possible, get involved. How do we change, as the question came, what do we do if there are anti-Semitic people running for office? Someone said, don't vote for them, campaign against them, run for office, help someone else run for office. We the people is part of the democracy. It only works if we, as the people, participate in our own democracy. So you have the power, we all have the power. And then of course, if we resist vilification and othering with whom we disagree, then we might have a chance of changing hearts and minds. We go beyond hurling accusations and dehumanizing others, that we are in today's polarized political environment that seems almost an impossibility. But I would say that we can always, as a group, try to meet this higher standard of upholding the universal principles of human dignity and actualization, and that we may have a chance to break this cycle of dissension. So in sum, I would like to say that an event like this one tonight is just such a beautiful example of building community, greater understanding, and illustrating the power of an engaged citizenry within a robust democracy. I celebrate each and every one of you who came today to you're all keeping democracy alive by coming to learn and think about what we can do for the future. So thank you again, Rabbi Wagner, our esteemed panelists, and to all of you for joining together, remembering, learning, and now taking